Okay. Okay, so welcome to session 9. After coming back from spring break, it always feels a little weird in the CUNY system that you come back from spring break and you have about 3 classes left. And so it's not really, but anyway. But this week, when we get into the power of fixed capital, and the week after, I generally regard this, and I think most people probably do, as the high point of the text. And it is about fixed capital and the consequences of fixed capital, which Marx recognizes that this distinction between fixed and circulating capital has, as he puts it on 298, he said, has a long history in the work of economists, so he spends a lot of time sort of talking about past ideas. But I thought it might be useful at this point to go back over Marx's main method of inquiry and of presentation, because there's some things that happen here which, if you treat them as something in itself, you get a particular idea of it. But if you situate it in relationship to Marx's general approach and situate it in relation to the general approach emerging in the Grundrisse, you get a very specific kind of interpretation coming out of it. And I thought the easiest way to do this is to go back over the framework that prevails in the first volume of Capital, and just to talk about how Marx sets it up in a dialectical mode of inquiry and presentation. Capital begins with the concept of the commodity. So, okay, you've got a commodity, you know what it is, you can imagine what we're talking about very easily. But Marx immediately says that this commodity has 2 faces, 2 aspects. One is that it's a use value, and the other is that it's exchange value. That is, the commodity internalizes a tension between use value and exchange value. And there is an antagonism here. If you want to use it, if you want to use the commodity, you can't sell it. If you sell it, you can't use it. So there is immediately then a contradiction, a tension within the concept of the commodity. So then Marx kind of says, but even though there is this tension, somehow or other, all commodities manage to exchange with each other. Therefore, they must have something in common. In mathematical terms, you would say there must be a numeraire to this whole kind of system, and there must be something in common that allows for the exchangeability of all these different use values. And that exchangeability is given by the idea that all these commodities are in somehow or other related to the application of human labor, and that therefore there is a theory of value to be extracted, which is about the labor incorporated within the commodity. So you go from commodity to use value, exchange value, and then you come back, as it were, to a unified idea of labor power and the application of human labor as being what is at the source of value. So he talks about value as socially necessary labor time. But then he immediately takes that unity which exists in value and says, but what kind of labor is it that actually is expressed in the commodity? And he immediately divides that notion of labor into 2 kinds. That is, the abstract labor and concrete labor. And what he means by this is, again, that there's an opposition within this notion of labor between concrete and abstract. The concrete is the actual number of hours worked by every single person who is engaging in commodity production and commodity selling. So this is one aspect of it. But then you realize that if you go to the market and somebody comes along with an object and says, well, I spent 10 hours making this, so I want the equivalent of 10 hours for this. and I look around and somebody's making a pretty much equivalent commodity in 2 hours. So which is it, 2 or 10 hours? And Marx kind of says, well, concrete labor is all of those things taken together. And so when, however, we have many thousands of people making exchanges, the concrete labor ends up with a social average somewhere. So it would end up that everybody in the market would be exchanging that particular commodity for, say, 3 hours labor. And if you went into the market with a 10-hour thing and somebody said, well, I can get the same thing for 3 hours, at some point you've got to come down and pay 3 hours. So abstract labor is the social average. It is the generality, if you like, whereas concrete labor is the particularity. These two sides can only come together if they are caught up in the act of exchange. And the act of exchange, therefore, is going to be expressive somehow or other of the quantity of human labor. But then Marx kind of, at this point, divides again and says, well, the quality and quantity here is going to depend upon the positionality, whether you're a buyer or a seller. So at this point, value turns into the idea of a relative form of value and an equivalent form of value. What I have is is the equivalent of what you have. What you have is the equivalent of what I have. So then Marx kind of says, so you've got this duality which is going on between relative and equivalent forms of value. They're all brought together back in the moment of exchange. And what you see is that this distinction between equivalent and relative crystallizes out into the idea that there is one commodity which is acting as the equivalent, and that commodity is going to be called the money commodity. In other words, we derive money. And we look and we say, yes, okay, money is the answer to this opposition between relative and equivalent. The opposition is then between money and all the other commodities for which money can be the medium of exchange. But you then look at money and say, well, what does money do? And you say money also has this dual aspect. It can be a medium of circulation, that is, it can facilitate circulation of commodities, or it can be a measure of value. So again, what Marx is doing throughout this whole thing is sort of getting if you like, a central concept, and then talking about its internal structure and its internal oppositions, which then generates another concept, which is a unitary concept, but which also has a duality. And he goes on in this vein. And so when you get to surplus value, you say, well, okay, there's surplus value, but then there's relative surplus value and absolute surplus value. And again, sometime in Capital, Marx kind of says, well, actually, there's only one form of surplus value with its absolute and its relative aspects. So this is Marx's method of proceeding. When he does this, however, one of the things that happens is he often leans to one side or other of a contradiction. So when, for example, he's talking about use values at the very beginning, he kind of mentions, well, there are millions of different uses that people have and all kinds of things. It's a very particularistic thing. Whereas the exchange value is not particularistic, it's rather universal or general. All commodities can be caught in exchange value. The use value is something, so that Marx kind of says, but capital is only interested in one side of this contradiction. They're interested in the exchange value side. They don't care, he says, about use values. The capitalist will produce any kind of use value you like, provided it gives them surplus value, gives them a profit. They'll do anything for profit, in other words, so that the use value is irrelevant to them. So Marx kind of says, we could discuss diversity of use values as much as we like, but actually the capitalist doesn't care particularly whether they produce this or that. If they want to produce, if somebody wants cyanide, capital will produce cyanide. If somebody wants guns, they'll produce guns. The capitalist is quite indifferent to the use values because their concern is to get the exchange value, in such a way that it gets the universal form of value in money and profit and all the rest of it. So when you're looking through volume 1 of Capital, and you say, well, what's he saying about use values? The answer is, he says, Capital is not interested in use values, so I'm not going to discuss use values. So as far as I'm concerned, use value is out of the discussion. It's part of the formulation that we're in, but it's merely an abstract formulation, and that's what we're going to do. Now, he continues in this vein, and this week what we're doing is we're looking at the relationship between fixed and circulating capital. In other words, up until this point, Marx has been talking about the circulation of capital, right? He's been talking about the relationship between production and realization in the market. He's been talking about how labor power is mobilized, what forms labor power takes, the capacity to labor, how that works in relationship to production of surplus value and all those kinds of things. So he's been talking about it as if everything is really structured around this idea of the circulation of capital. Remember the diagram where money is used to buy commodities. The commodities are taken in production. The production produces a new commodity. The new commodity is taken to market and sold, and then the money is distributed amongst the different ways, and then it flows back. So that's what he's talking about up until now. But now he's kind of saying there's a distinction here between fixed and circulating capital, and immediately you will notice one of the forms of that distinction. When he's been discussing circulating capital, one of the things he's emphasized is the fluidity, all right, and the continuity, and the speed and the turnover and all of these kinds of things. So when he's talking about circulating capital, he's talking about the necessity of continuity. He's talking about the necessity of speed up. He's talking about the necessity of driving past any blockages in the market or blockages in labor procurement and so on. So you get an idea about what capital is from the study of circulating capital. And it is very much about this idea. And value, while it's not specifically said here, is ultimately going to be termed value in motion. And the motion becomes terribly important, and the speed up becomes terribly important. If I can do it faster than you, I have a competitive advantage to you. Therefore, the kind of technology that allows for speed up is going to be adopted, and so on. So we've got that kind of idea has been in our head. But here we come across something about a fixed capital. And I mentioned earlier, Marx starts to talk about one of the barriers which exist to the continuity of capital accumulation is fixation and a blockage which occurs because something is kind of stuck and it can't move. And if it can't move, it gets devalued. And so Marx introduces this category of fixated capital, which is negation of fluid capital. And the negation is such that it results in devaluation, that the value gets lost because the movement cannot be continued. So it's very much about fluidity, movement, and all the rest of it. But fixed capital suddenly appears as something which is completely different. The problem with fixed capital is it's fixed, okay? And because it's fixed, it doesn't accord at all with many of the conditions which Marx has laid out as being necessary for circulating capital to operate. In other words, fixed capital is going to be something which is about actually something going completely opposite direction to circulating capital. And in exactly the same way that Marx talks of the commodity as having a use value and exchange value, and there's an opposition between them, Marx has up until now just been talking about continuous value in motion and all of the things that are going on in terms of speed up and so on. In other words, he's been talking about one side of a contradiction, which is the circulating side. He's now kind of introducing the idea that some of capital is fixed. And how does it become fixed, and why does it become fixed? Then becomes part of the problem, and how then to understand what's going on in terms of fixed capital. Now, the reason I've wanted to go at it this way is to say this, that as Marx gets into fixed capital, he starts at a certain point to almost ignore the other side of the contradiction. That is, he starts to talk about fixed capital in itself as if circulating capital doesn't matter anymore, as if circulating capital is becoming like use value or something like that. It just doesn't work anymore. But fixed capital is going to be looked at in terms of what is fixed capital in itself? What is fixed capital all about? And there's a lot of sort of jousting that goes on here, because clearly fixed capital relative to circulating capital crystallizes out as a very significant differentiation. This is something that the classical political economists, Ricardo in particular, looked at very closely, and it became absolutely critical for the nature of the political economy that they were developing. But fixed capital presumes that a certain kind of capital arises, which is fixed and unchanging over a certain period of time. In other words, whereas the circulating capital, you see that there's this thrust towards speed up, what in effect happens with fixed capital is it all slows down. It stops. And if it stops, it means that the threat of devaluation occurs. So how do we then sort of somehow or other work with fixed capital, and why do we work with fixed capital? Well, it has a lot to do with the way in which technologies become instantiated in things like machines and factories and so on, which last longer than the average turnover time. Now, there's a problem here immediately, which is fixed in relationship to what? And Marx takes the easy way out and kind of says, well, I'm going to assume that the standard period of turnover of capital is 1 year. And I do that because agriculture typically works on an annual basis. And in the same way that we start to talk about labor power on the basis of a 24-hour day, and we talk about the value of labor power being equivalent to 5 hours labor or something of this kind. In exactly that same way, I assume that there is a standard turnover time, and he sort of waffles a bit about this and says, well, in practice, of course, we find that something is much shorter or much longer or so on. But let's assume that the 1 year turnover time is right. What fixed capital is about is that you have inputs which into your production process, which are not all used up in the 1 year. Now, if it's 1 year and a day, well, okay, there's no difference. But here, what we're talking about here is certain inputs like machines, which last, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, a house, 30 years, and that therefore the value which they incorporate is fixed for that whole period of time. So immediately then you've got this problem of how do we actually think about the lifetime of the fixed capital? And how then do we also think about how value is circulated through fixed capital? In other words, a machine is a commodity. It's produced through circulating capital as a machine, and it is then sold to somebody who's going to use it. And somebody takes the machine, and that machine has a certain value. Let's suppose it's worth 100 units. And that machine then is going to be used not simply for this year, but for the next year and the year after that and the year after that. And the question then arises is, what is the lifetime of a machine? And there's no easy answer to that. You can look at it physically and say, well, okay, a machine is going to last for 10 years. How long does an automobile last, for example? Well, somebody's got driving around in an automobile that was made in 1930 somewhere. But automobiles tend to have a lifetime of a certain sort before. But the lifetime of the machine is not only a physical thing. In some cases, it is very physical, and you can make reasonable calculations as to how long a machine will go before it wears out. But in other cases, you won't have that. And you'll just have, well, okay, maybe it lasts for 10 years, maybe it lasts for 15 years, maybe it lasts for 20 years. And at a certain point, in exactly the same way that Marx talks about abstract and concrete labor, so we've got the concrete uses of machines and the abstract. In other words, let's suppose that we have cotton industries, and there's lots of cotton factories around, and each one has a loom. Some looms may last, 20 years, and some looms may last 5 years. You could say, well, the average lifetime of the loom is maybe 12 years or something of this kind. So that you would say that if you're lucky, you can get maybe another 5 years out of it. If you're unlucky, it'll go out of business after 5 years. So the concrete conditions are variable, but there will be an average. And the average lifetime of a machine. What is the average lifetime of an automobile? What's the average lifetime of a forklift truck? Whatever. So you've got an average lifetime. But then you've got something else coming in, which is beyond the average lifetime and affects the average lifetime. For example, if I buy a machine and it has certain qualities and certain efficiencies and all this kind of thing, somebody may come up with a new machine, which is A, much cheaper, and B, much more efficient. Now, I'm using the old machine, which had a high value and a certain physical lifetime, but now suddenly somebody's come up with a new machine which has a longer lifetime and is much more efficient and much more effective and much more productive. So in that case, you get something which Marx rather acutely calls moral depreciation. So you have physical depreciation, that is a physical loss of value, and then you've got moral depreciation, which is about the fact that somebody's likely to come up with a machine which is better than the one I've got, in which case what I paid for it and what and the efficiency I got out of it is no more relevant to the discussion, because I have to get to the social average and have to accept the social average, and I may find my machine gets devalued because it becomes so obsolescent, and that you should really start to plan obsolescence. So one of the things that Marx talks about and says, well, this threat of premature devaluation of your existing machinery is countered by the capitalist by a certain strategy. That is, instead of working the machine for 8 hours a day, you work it for 24 hours a day. So you introduce the shift system. And you do that, and it means that you actually consume the value in the machine faster because you use it for 3 sessions a day rather than for just one. And that means you introduce the shift system, which has implications for labor, right? So you have all those things which are going on there. So the lifetime of the machine is highly problematic, and you don't know exactly how to use it. And secondly, there is the problem of how does the value of the machine get transferred into the product. If I'm making cotton cloth, I have an input of cotton. So I can say the value of the cotton is transferred into the product through labor. Labor takes the cotton and makes cotton cloth out of it. And so the value of the cotton is incorporated in that. So there is a physical transfer of the material into the cotton cloth, and that then can calculate the value. And then you would say something like, okay, we need 10 years. We're going to have the lifetime of the machine 10 years, and 1/10 of the value of the machine ends up inside of the cotton cloth. Now, this is not a physical transfer. This is a social transfer. I mean, it's not as if 10% of the machine flies off into the cotton cloth. No, the machine remains with you over the 10 years. And what you do then is you come up with this notion of a depreciation, what they call a straight line depreciation, that if a machine is worth 100 units, then 10 units per year for over 10 years will get you to the point where you've depreciated the value of the machine, and you can then go buy a new machine. And presumably the old machine is worn out, or it's become so inefficient that you don't want to use it anymore, and so in which case you sell it to somebody in Ghana or somewhere for nothing, so they can use it. So the machine then has these two things, that it needs to come up with a schedule which is talking about the transfer of the value into the product, and you can use straight line depreciation, or you can start to take account of the average rate of moral depreciation. That is, how fast are new machines coming onto the market, and how fast are they moving, and all the rest of it. So the machine industry then becomes very the use of the machine. Now, the use of the machine is, of course, about increasing the productivity of labor. So Marx writes extensively about the distinction between handloom weavers and the power loom weavers. I mean, when people started to get the power loom, they could produce far, far more cotton cloth than could be produced by the handloom weavers. And eventually they drove the handloom weavers out of business by the superior machine. And then even more superior machines came on to it. So this is, if you like, the issue here. Clearly, from the standpoint of relative surplus value, that is, from the standpoint of raising the social productivity of labor, machines are terribly important to the capitalist. And so the capitalist is going to, under the competitive rules and the coercive laws of competition, which Marx gets into a little bit in here when he talks about, free of competition and all the rest of it, and what that's about. So we get some discussion of that in here. Under the coercive laws of competition, capitalists are bound to actually end up with similar technologies. And if I have a technology which is superior to yours, I drive you out of business. You adopt my technology or go beyond my technology and drive me out of business. So the coercive laws of competition mean that there's competition over using machines. So there's no argument about why capital might employ machines. The coercive laws of competition force individual capitalists to do that. But once you've got a machine, then you have to come up with a strategy of how to use it and how to depreciate it. And you have to set up a depreciation schedule, and that is kind of pretty much arbitrary. In some instances, like I've said, the machine may have a physical lifetime. Things wear out. But then it turns out in complex machines, different parts of the machines have different lifetimes. I mean, think of, just think of something you may be very familiar with, a house. It's not a form of fixed capital in most instances, but in some instances, houses are converted into fixed capital. And if it's converted into fixed capital, then you've got to depreciate what's in the house. Now, how long do the lights last? How long do the walls last? How long does the kitchen stove last? How long does the roof last? In other words, you have different lifetimes of different elements of a machine. So if you take a forklift truck, you would similarly find different, you have to renew this every 6 months. You have to, do something with the tires every year, and do things with the motor, once every. So So this then becomes an extremely complicated kind of business, but you can't breeze by it and say, okay, it's just complicated and I can't do anything. And there has to be a social average, and there has to be, if you like, rules about depreciation. In fact, one of the things that is extremely interesting about tax codes is depreciation. If you have something, you depreciate it. Now, do you depreciate it on an accelerated rate, or do you depreciate it over 10 years? One of the things that Ronald Reagan did when he came into power was to say to everybody, you can depreciate the value of your fixed capital in 2 years. In other words, you could get complete tax write-off in 2 years, which meant that the value to you of using that fixed capital, the moral hazard aspect of it, the moral depreciation aspect of it, was to reduce the lifetime, the relevant lifetime of the machine to a couple of years. So after 2 or 3 years, you in effect get no tax benefits from depreciation because you've already depreciated the whole machine. And this was a clever way of allowing people to start to accelerate depreciation, which meant they then could buy new equipment and would buy new equipment at an accelerated rate, which is a way of accelerating the rising productivity. This was the idea behind it, but the idea was also, and this is something which we now have to also introduce the fact that some of the fixed capital is of an independent kind, and some of that independent kind fixed capital is actually embedded in space. Reagan's tax law, which allowed you to depreciate with a fixed capital wherever you were, actually facilitated the mobility of capital. I mean, if you have say a cotton mill in Massachusetts, and you've got a lot of fixed capital in the cotton mill, but if you can write it off in a couple of years, then after a couple of years you can move because you've already got back what you've been spending, what you wanted to get back. So actually, Ronald Reagan's tax law facilitated the deindustrialization of the Northeast and the Midwest in favor of moving to the Sun Belt. So you see this huge movement going on in the 1980s in the Sun Belt, towards the Sun Belt from the Rust Belt. And a lot of that was facilitated by changing tax rules on depreciation. Am I clear on this? You got this? This is so these things are lost in the details, but when you start to work out the details, you see they have huge impacts. That accelerated depreciation schedule that Reagan allowed, that you could depreciate all of your fixed assets in 2 years, meant that after 2 years you could move out and you could move somewhere else. And since people, since the states in the South and the Sun Belt were offering good deals, and besides they were non-union states and all the rest of it, capital kind of was facilitated to move by changing tax rules, because this then goes to the question which I started with, which is to say the problem with fixed capital is it is fixed. So you have to find some economic and social way to get the benefits of the fixed capital, which are the rising productivity of labor, and at the same time, somehow or other find ways to match the continuity which exists there in terms of circulating capital and the like. But the fixity then is not simply about the nature of the fixed capital. Fixed capital can start off as a single machine, and Marx kind of knows that and deals with that, but in a way that's not the problem, or not the interesting part of it. The interesting part is when you start to get what you might call a kind of machine technology in general, automated factories, whole kind of things of that kind. So Marx starts to talk about the machine system. It's a system of automatons and moving parts. So you're talking not only about a machine, you're talking about the machine system and what it's about. And you start to see that emerging in Manchester industrialism, that you're not dealing simply with a machine, you're dealing with a whole kind of machine world. But then you start to say, well, Marx also then starts to say, well, you're not only dealing with machines in factories, you're also dealing with fixed capital of an independent kind. Roads, sewers, ports, harbours, airports, this kind of stuff. And some of this fixed capital of an independent kind is embedded in the landscape. It's immobile. So you've got immobile. Now, just think of this a moment. Next time you go to an airport, just look around you and see how much value was involved in the production of an airport. And look at what is there. I mean, this is a huge thing. I mean, the rejigging of LaGuardia cost about $8 billion. Imagine if you wanted to build an airport from scratch. What it would take. And this is a huge investment, and it's fixed. And Marx then makes the point that the fact that it's fixed means that you've got to use it. So there's an irony here, which is that fixed capital requires that circulating capital actually come to use whatever it is you have built. If you build an airport and no planes fly to it, the money's all lost. There's a classic case of that south of Madrid. The new airport was supposed to relieve congestion in Madrid, in Ciudad Real. It was about $3 billion or something like that it cost, but no planes flew to it. Nobody wanted to use it because they renovated Madrid, and then along came COVID and all the rest of it. So it was lost, and that cost about, I don't know, 2 or 3 billion euros, and it's lost. Except it is not lost because all of the circulating capital which went into the building of it got its money. The construction companies, the furnishing companies, all of the things that go into an airport. But then think about how that airport is going to be built. And here Marx has introduced earlier on something else which is very significant, which is that fixed capital of this kind in particular, but actually fixed capital of this kind in general, will circulate in return for interest. And so what happens here, when you get to fixed capital, is you suddenly see that you're no longer talking about surplus value. You're talking about profit of enterprise and interest of money capital. And the surplus value divides, all right, into movement of capital in the sense that we've already been talking about it, and the movement of interest-bearing capital. Now, one of the things that then happened during this last period in the capitalist world, the interest rate was very low. And people were pointing out that if the interest rate is very low, then this facilitates lots and lots of investment in the built environment. And we see some of that. But other people pointed out that this was a lost opportunity because the interest rate was so low that you could go do things like LaGuardia and so on. But a lot of that was not done. People were bemoaning the fact that the interest rate was very low and we could actually completely renew infrastructures in the United States. But we didn't do it because there was not the initiative to do it, because by and large, big capital, and remember this stuff about the road, big capital will only get into doing this itself. Otherwise, it has to be state-led. And we have this period where We get austerity politics, which stops you. It was totally irrational. The interest rate was very low, and you could renew infrastructure like crazy at a very low cost. But we didn't do it because everybody was going on and on about austerity and how important austerity was, and there were limitations on state expenditures. LaGuardia renewal was one of the exceptions. But think about that you know that this is the sort of thing that you have to get into when you start to talk about fixed capital formation. And then it turns out that we're not only dealing with fixed capital, we also have to start to deal with something called the consumption fund. Now, the consumption fund says, well, in exactly the same way that fixed capital is required to assist the production of cotton cloth or lithium batteries or whatever, in the same way that fixed capital is required to do that, so we need fixed consumer items which assist consumption. The most obvious one is a housing for people. And Marx says, well, this is rather similar. You know, a house lasts 30 years. How are you going to buy the mortgage? The mortgage on a house is typically 30 years. How are people going to buy housing if they don't have some sort of investment schedule? Which then leads Marx into another general observation, which is that the credit system is absolutely essential. We saw this in differential turnover times, but now when you get to fixed capital, we're talking about the lifetime of the machine, the lifetime of an airport, the lifetime of fixed capital investments, the lifetime of a house, all those kinds of things. The only way you can start to work with this is through the development of a credit system, and the development of a credit system such that interest-bearing capital separates as a separate current of movement, and interest-bearing capital, as we will see in the very final session that we do, the circulation of interest-bearing capital supports the formation of a financier class and a class of moneyed capitalists who have a very specific role to play in a capitalist society. That is, they didn't come out of the blue. They came out of the fact that fixed capital is required in production. The fixed capital requires interest-bearing capital in order to function. Interest-bearing capital requires a credit system, a sophisticated credit system, and a circulation of interest-bearing capital. And then also there comes this distinction between finance and active production. Put it this way: you are a producer of a particular commodity. You're going through that circuit that we've talked about. You've got some fixed capital involved. This circuit is critical for how you actually are thinking about your own investment strategies. One of the things you may find yourself doing is at the end of a particular turnover period, you'll end up with a certain amount of money, extra money, surplus value. Now, what are you going to do with it? There are really three options. You can consume it, just consume it away. And if you keep on consuming away your surplus value, you're not going to remain a capitalist very long. So that'll be end of you. After a few years, you'll have drained everything away. So that's one option, and some people will do that. So that is one possibility. The second possibility is that, okay, you've got extra money, you've got surplus value, you expand your production, right? So you're making widgets, and you're making 2,000 widgets, and you add another widget maker, and you're making 3,000 widgets. So you can expand your production, okay? So by reinvestment. So you reinvest in your production, but you also reinvest in expansion. The third possibility is you say, well, actually the market for widgets is pretty full right now. I don't think I'm going to get anywhere if I expand my widget production because there's not a demand for it. So what do you do then with your money? Well, one of the things you can do is to loan it to somebody else. Okay? In which case, you instead of going into production, you simply become a rentier and you lend the money to somebody else who wants to start a factory making something else, or somebody who wants to expand double fast, and so you lend it to them at the rate of interest. So at a certain point, you start to look upon your operation as having two flows going through it instead of one. So far, we've been thinking of one flow, which is the flow of production into surplus value. But we're now looking at this flow of money, and we're saying, am I going to use the money for myself, or am I going to invest it in somebody else and lend it to somebody else, or am I going to consume it away? Let's leave that out of the picture. So this is the choice you're going to make. So at a certain point, you will decide what you're going to do. Now, the other thing, of course, well, a midpoint of those two things is to say, well, okay, I've got a factory making widgets, but there's another kind of thing I'd like to make, which is very close to widgets, which you call wadgets. So I'm going to have a factory of wadgets and build a. So you start to expand your business, but not investing in the same thing. So you can also think in those terms. So the capitalist then takes on a dual personality. Now notice this again. We always have this kind of, in Marx, I've talked about the way in which he splits a coherent concept like commodity into use and exchange value. And the capitalist now has been formally considered to be only concerned with surplus value. But now we see the capitalist has splits into two personas. That is, money investor and producer. And at a certain point, as a money investor, you may want to really expand your widget factory hugely. You don't have enough coming out of your reinvestment to do that. So what you do is you may borrow money. In other words, you may borrow money in order to expand production. So this borrowing of money to expand production is, I think, a very important possibility. So when you're thinking as a capitalist, you'll be thinking both about the monetary side and the production side. And at a certain point, and Marx argues this earlier on, at a certain point, capitalists will kind of say, I don't know whether I'm really interested in continuing to be bothered with production. I have these laborers who are a problem of management and all the rest of it. So I'll just take the money and become a rentier. I'll just lend money out to other people and I'll live off the interest. So Marx is kind of saying these are the sorts of things that start to emerge when you introduce fixed capital into the equation, because fixed capital is very much about, as he says, the logic of the credit system flows out of fixed capital formation. The logic of interest, the flow of interest-bearing capital flows out of the investments that are required for fixed capital formation. All of these elements become part and parcel of the story. So this is why the power of fixed capital becomes so significant. And I think that in the midst of it, of course, is also this question, which comes back again and again, about the flow of circulating capital versus the fixity. And there's a sort of paradox in this. And the paradox of this is that you invest in fixed capital in order to create the infrastructures that allow circulating capital to move faster. But circulating capital has to move in such a way that it valorizes or validates the fixed capital investment. So you, if you build a huge airport, in order to get the money back from it, you've got to make sure the planes fly there, which means that you've got to have attractive destinations at the end of it and important destinations at the end of it. Now, in major metropolitan areas, that's not a terrible problem, but in some parts of the world and some airports, it's a particular problem. And so what this means is that what Marx does here is to largely talk about fixed capital in itself. And it doesn't really talk about the relationship too much with circulating capital. But as we will see next week in particular, this relationship between the two becomes a very contentious kind of question. And how the continuity and the motion relates to the fixity and the tension of actually making sure that the fixed capital is used. And here is another modification of the argument. Up until now, Marx has taken the view that capitalists don't care about use value. But they do when it comes to fixed capital, because fixed capital is defined by its use. And this in itself creates some fascinating diversions. If the use, fixed capital is capital used in a certain way. It's used to make machines which assist in production but do not actually enter into production. So this form of fixed capital is useful, and therefore we can switch its uses. And I use the example of sewing machines. Are sewing machines fixed capital? Depends how they're used. Fixed capital, and I kind of mentioned when I was a kid, my grandmother had a sewing machine. Most working class families had sewing machines, interestingly, because they made all their own clothes. And curtains and everything was, so sewing machine was much used in my grandparents' generation. And I remember my grandmother doing it and using it. But then, of course, sewing machines also end up in factories, sweatshops. So if I take all the sewing machines I can find and I set up a sort of mini factory in my basement, then the sewing machines become a form of fixed capital because they're being used to produce surplus value. When they're not being used to produce surplus value, they're just consumer durables. And I always like to mention this case, that the theory of economic development, the capitalist theory of it, said you have to, if you want to become a consumer society, you have to actually create a form of economic growth, the first step of which is to create the necessary infrastructures and fixed capital structures which can actually support an industrial economy. I mean, this was the argument. And in order to do that, you had to take away from circulating capital from immediate consumption. In other words, you tightened your belt and you use the surpluses from tightening your belt to build the infrastructures which were going to allow economic growth to take off. This was the takeoff theory in economic growth. And this is what Walt Rostow talked about in the 1950s, and this was, a lot of data was connected to show that, yeah, this is roughly the case. The problem was it didn't apply to Britain. There was no sign of any vast increase and surge of fixed capital investment in Britain in the 18th century. There's no sign of it whatsoever. And the reason was that there was so much there in the consumption fund that could be used. A lot of the highways and toll roads and all these kinds of things were already there. The infrastructures were already there. Some of the materials were easily there. So you didn't need a vast wave of fixed capital investment because the physical infrastructure of this country was already there and it could be used. And could be used by switching into fixed capital formation. So changes of use actually change what the category is doing. And if you take it contemporaneously, you would see, well, okay, a lot of fixed capital, which used to be fixed capital, has gone into the consumption fund. Where? Well, look at all the warehouses and cotton mills that have been turned into condos and all the rest of it. They just switch uses. And as they switch uses, they go from the fixed capital to the consumption fund. And that can be done the other way also. When you start the sort of all of the microcredit stuff came in, and you encouraged peasant families to take out microcredit and start to use the microcredit to set up productive activities in their peasant households, then you suddenly find, the peasant hut has become a form of fixed capital because it's housing. All right, and what's going to be interesting, I think, is these shifts of categories right now in urban areas. A lot of office space and things like that has become redundant because people are working from home. So in effect, you can start to economize on office space if people are working from home, which means that people's homes are becoming part of the fixed capital of whatever it is you're doing. So these categories shift depending upon use. And as Marx kind of says in here, he says, at this point, use value becomes critical to the argument. All along up until this point, he said, capitalists are not interested in use values. But on this matter of use values, they are. How fixed capital is used, are the sewing machines used on the consumption side, or are they used for the production side? This is the use thing. And at this point, capitalists start to become acutely aware of the importance of the use value. So Marx kind of says, oh, well, okay, here I've been saying use value is kind of irrelevant as far as the capitalists are concerned, but when it comes to fixed capital, use value is everything. If it's not used to support surplus value production, then it's not fixed capital. It is fixed capital if it is used that way. And switches in uses can signal certain important things happening in a society. So these are some of the issues that arise with fixed capital, and I think that I would want to add just a few quotes here. Once adopted into the production process of capital, the means of labor, that is the machinery and so on, passes through various metamorphoses whose culmination is the machine, or rather an automatic system of machinery, set in motion by an automaton, a moving power that moves itself, consisting of many mechanical and intellectual organs, so that the workers themselves are cast merely as its conscious linkages. This is really, I think, a fantastic evocation in which the material quality of the means of labor is transformed into an existence adequate to fixed capital. Now, again, the labor implications of all of this are taken up, and Marx is concerned with an examination of an automatic system of machinery. And the result of this, and this is the result of Marx's concentration on the Manchester industrial system, is that the worker becomes a machine minder rather than a direct producer. And this means that, as he says, capital can mobilize science and technology instead of worker skills. And this leads to a tension in which the value-creating power of the individual labor capacity is an infinitesimal vanishing magnitude. That is, when you've got when you've got a machinery system in which workers have been much reduced in numbers and have become machine minders with high productivity. When you get something of this kind, then you kind of say, well, what's the point of the labor theory of value? When in fact the labor content of something is reduced to this infinitesimal vanishing magnitude. And I quote him on page 694 of Grundrisse. In machinery, objectified labor itself appears not only in the form of product, but in the form of the force of production itself. The development of means of labor into machinery is not an accidental moment of capital, but is rather the historical reshaping of the traditional inherited means of labor into a form adequate to capital. And it's very interesting language, this, a form adequate to capital. This occurs several times in these chapters, a form adequate to capital. That is, there was always technology around, but now we're seeing it reorganized in a form adequate to capital. There was always labor capacity around, but now we're seeing it turned into machine minders, which is a form adequate to capital. The accumulation of knowledge and of skill, of the general productive forces of the social brain, is thus absorbed into capital. Now, one of the things that capital relied on historically was the skill and knowledge and understanding of production processes of the artisan worker. But Marx is now saying those have been rendered irrelevant by the science and technology, which is now taking over in terms of the reconstruction of the technical gross bases of production. And he says the productive forces of the social brain are absorbed into capital as opposed to labor, and hence appear as an attribute of capital, or more specifically, of fixed capital. Which leads him into the obvious contradiction, which I started out by mentioning. Insofar as fixed capital is condemned to an existence within the confines of a specific use value, it does not correspond to the concept of capital, which, as value, is indifferent to every specific form of use value and could adopt or shed any of them as equivalent incarnations. If capital is defined by its use, the problem is that it is fixed capital. The problem with fixed capital is that it is fixed, whereas circulating capital is about fluidity, flexibility, transformation, and motion. Fixed capital, and this is me editing, so it gums things up and holds things down. It is therefore circulating capital, which appears as the adequate form of capital, and not fixed capital. Nevertheless, insofar as machinery develops with the accumulation of society's science, a productive force generally, general social labor presents itself not in labor but in capital. The production force of society is measured in fixed capital, exists there in its objective form. Now, I think this is so interesting that Marx is saying this because, when I look out the airport and see all that fixed capital around, I'm used to being around it. But in Marx's day, the fixed capital was relatively restricted. And in the Manchester system, it was largely caught up in just the factories and the machines. But now, of course, the ports and harbours and communications terminals and so on were relatively mild. The ports were quite small and all the rest of it. But now you look at the automated harbour facilities in Shenzhen in China and so on, the astonishing capacities which exist. You look at the airports, you look at all these things, and you kind of say, we live in a world of fixity. At the same time as we're supposed to be high in motion. And so, as he says, the powers of society are measured in fixed capital. They exist there in a subjective form. And inversely, the productive force of capital grows with the general progress which capital appropriates free of charge in machinery, knowledge, and the like. Knowledge appears, however, as alien, external to the labourer and to living labour, subsumed under self-activating objectified labour. So this chapter is talking about, however, the way in which fixed capital disempowers labour, goes against circulating capital, and which also becomes, in a sense, sclerotic. So on the one hand, you have this kind of push for intense fluidity, which comes up against the sclerotic character of fixed capital formation, which can only sort of shift very, very slowly, even when there are techniques to make sure it can fixed capital can become more fluid. And I've mentioned one of them is to set the tax system in such a way that you can abandon your fixed capital and let it rot and go somewhere else by having an adequate tax system. So there are some serious issues here, and it leads Marx to kind of comment that this even creates a challenge, a serious challenge, to the relevance of the labour theory of value. I mean, the labour theory of value, which started out capital and which has been so far very, very significant here, is now in a way threatened by the existence of fixed capital. This is what Marx says on page 700. To the degree that labour time, the mere quantity of labour, is posited by capital as the sole determinant element, to that degree does direct labour and its quantity disappear as a determining principle of production, of the creation of use values, and is reduced both quantitatively to a smaller proportion and qualitatively as an, of course, indispensable but subordinate moment, compared to general scientific labour, technological application of natural sciences on one side, and to the general productive force arising from social combination in total production on the other side. A combination which appears as a natural fruit of social labour, although it is a historical product. Capital thus works it towards its own dissolution as the form dominating production. Now, this is pretty strong stuff. I mean, Marx often likes to talk about, capital disappearing itself and dissolving itself. He likes to talk about those things, but here he's being very specific and saying that the mechanism seems to be the one in which, to begin with, it is no longer the individual labourer who we can look at and talk about as being productive or unproductive, which sort of thing we talked about earlier, the songstress who creates surplus value for the impresario is a productive labourer, but somebody who's singing for fun is not. So we have all those kinds of discussions about what is productive and unproductive labour, but Marx is saying that all becomes irrelevant when you look at the machine system. You then are no longer looking at the individual, you're looking at the mass. Because when you think of the machine system, then everything that is supporting the machine system the plumber, the electrician, all the rest of it, they're all part of this collective enterprise. And therefore, it's the collective enterprise which is the entity we should be looking at. It is the working mass that we need to look at, not the individual laborer. We can't say anything about productivity by looking at individual laborers anymore. We can only say something about productivity when we look at the working mass and mass production and all the rest of it. So this is, and if that is the case, then what happens to the labor theory of value? And what we're getting sense here is that the labor theory of value is no longer relevant in the form in which it was initially set up. But there is still some truth to it, but we don't know exactly what it is. So towards the end of this, he starts to talk about the way in which circulating labor and fixed capital circulation, when you put them back together again, you start to see a slightly different picture. But just looking at the consequences of fixed capital formation, the circulation of interest-bearing capital and circulation of loan capital, the distinction between all of those things going on. As soon as you get into the weeds of all of this, the simplicity of the labor theory of value starts to disappear. And you get so Marx no longer is going to be talking about what is productive and unproductive labor, because it's the mass that becomes important. And we're going to actually also later on come back to this question of the mass, because Marx, I think, is going to say, well, if we're going to maintain some understanding coming out of the labor theory of value, which is also looking in that progressive way towards the dissolution of the powers of capital, then the dissolution of the powers of capital will be part of the consequence of this kind of process. As things stand, in fact, it's the other way around. That what is happening is that capital is absorbing understanding, knowledge, science, technology, all of those kinds of things, and is using them to reduce the power of labor and the significance of labor. So while the labor theory of value may be in jeopardy, what is not in jeopardy is the power of the capitalist class. So the power of the capitalist class stays here, but it has this different world which is being built. So in this section, and I urge you to go back over it very, very carefully to some degree. In this section, there are some astonishing assertions being made, and I'm not sure that I understand all the implications of all of them. And I think what you have to do is to go through them and find out what you really think about them and how you read them, because this is powerful stuff. And it's very, very relevant, because in exactly the same way that Marx was confronting the future of capital under conditions of automation and under conditions of machine technology and machine coming and the mobilization of science and all those kinds of things, the destruction of the power of the kind of labor that has talent and skills and all this. So you're de-skilling the labor force and doing all this kind of thing. You're disempowering labor and making labor feel more and more helpless. As he talks about it, labor feels more and more helpless because most of what is going on is now alien to them, beyond them. They are no longer in control. Well, they were in control of the machines in the 18th century, but they're now no longer in control. The control belongs in mechanism, lies within the machine. Behind the machine lies the capitalist, and so we've got this sort of thing. But this is, of course, the kind of discussion we're having about artificial intelligence. So if you read this section and go back over it and think about it in relationship to artificial intelligence, I think you'll find some very interesting insights. both into what the questions are that we might ask about artificial intelligence, but I think also about where we might be headed with artificial intelligence, to the degree that Marx is recognizing that even in 1858 there were signs of a movement towards things. And what we're seeing here today is a kind of a much bigger, scaled up and intensified clash, if you like, between circulating capital and fixed capital. And that clash is really the topic of the next section, so we'll defer consideration of it until the next time. So these are some of the comments that I would make about this whole thing. It's I don't know what you thought. I find this stuff fascinating, really interesting, and we need to come to grips with many of the facets of it that Marx is setting up. So why don't I throw it open now? I don't know how much time we've got left, but to any discussions you want to make?
Thank you. So as you were talking and thinking specifically about the example of the sewing machine and whether or not we can see it as fixed capital depends on the use that it is put to. To the extent that social reproduction is about the production of labor power as a commodity, can't technology like sewing machines or dishwashers or laundry machines, et cetera, which are sort of the infrastructure of everyday life, be seen precisely as fixed capital from that perspective?
I think what Marx would do is to say, no, you consider it as part of the consumption fund. But remember the concept of the totality. And the totality will say there is no one isolated thing that is not connected to other things. The conditions of social reproduction are clearly significant for, in relationship to production. So you can't have production without social reproduction. And that the circulation of labor capacity obviously will draw upon many of these consumer durables for purposes of social reproduction of labor power, but many other things as well. So yes, you're right to kind of say, well, yeah, when you look at the totality, there's obviously a link between what's going on in the moment of social reproduction and what's going on in production. But I think that Marx would want to reserve the idea of fixed capital as something which is has a direct relation to the production of surplus value, as opposed to the indirect relation that comes from. So I would rather keep the language that way. I think that's the way he's dealing with it. He acknowledges, I think, at a certain point, I'm trying to remember exactly where the point you're making, which is that social reproduction is not outside of all of this, but a lot of this, I think, would come out from a deeper analysis of the consumption fund, which Marx doesn't do. He just simply says it's there and we need to, understand something about it, but he doesn't actually do it. This is the sort of thing that is left for you and I to do.
All right. There's a similar question online about fixed capital, but I think you kind of answered it, but I'll raise it. Should all public infrastructure, electrical lines, rail lines, dams, etc., be understood as fixed capital, or are there other forms of fixed capital that are more appropriate?
Well, Marx's choice of language here is to say there are forms of fixed capital that have there are forms of physical infrastructure that have joint uses. And he talks about the fact that a road can be used to ship commodities or for taking walks. and an airport can be used for both things. So there are joint uses. Now, Marx doesn't get into it very much, but twice in this passage, we find him talking about this. And see if I can pick it up. Yeah. On 308, he says, a house can serve for production as well as for consumption. Likewise, all vehicles, a ship or a wagon, for pleasure outings as well as a means of transport. The street as a means of communication for production proper as well as for taking walks. Joint uses are all too common. Now, this is an interesting thing. Bourgeois economics has had a great deal of theoretical difficulty over handling joint uses. And there are many products which have joint uses. Well, you see, a sheep you can have for wool, for meat, for milk. Okay? So you kind of go, well, which one of those is it? You know, when you've got three products coming from the same animal, this is a bit of a problem of how do you value the different products in relationship to the general structure. So there are many issues, and so the joint products problem in theoretical economics, bourgeois economics, is a significant one. Marx is raising it here as also being significant as being there, but it's just being there. But again, as I indicated earlier, I think Marx's choice of language here is to try to distinguish between that which is direct production based and that which is intermediated through consumerism of some kind and through labor. This joint products issue is raised elsewhere as well. So Marx is clearly aware of it, and I think we should be obviously aware of it. But notice also the famous. I mentioned this, the whole kind of thrust of Taylorism, which was this time and motion study, which was set up by this guy Taylor in the 1980s, I think it was, in which he tried to break down all production processes into micro components and then have specialists dealing with the parts. And his aim, and he said this directly, is that the labor process should be partitioned in such a way and redesigned in such a way that it could be operated by, this is his language, a trained guerrilla. Now you can see where this is going in terms of the notion of what kind of labor you want and the kind of almost racial connotation that has of biological inferiority somehow or other built into the notion that somehow or other you can get zombies to do it or train guerrillas to do it. So the aim of a lot of innovation in Marx's theory is about de-skilling of the laborer and the taking away of any powers of labor, that the residual powers that labor has, and the reduction of the laborer to a state of zombieism or trained guerrillaism or whatever. So this is part of what we're looking at here is the reduction of labor to a relatively powerless condition, which obviously has significance in terms of class consciousness and class action. Sorry, there was somebody here. You had a question?
It wasn't fully ready, so. But if I may ask, like, to emphasize more on the, like you were saying, or we were talking about how the labor theory of value becomes threatened more and more. And you said something that, yeah, labor theory of value is in jeopardy. What's not in jeopardy is the power of the capitalist class.
Right.
And can you emphasize more on that? Like, what is a capitalist a class with basically, if, and I don't know if that's correct, if values now is not coming from labor, or if we see this diminishing role and contribution of labor, with also other things that you mentioned, like the skilling labor, the alienation, like the exclusion, and so on. So yeah, like what is the world where labor theory of value is irrelevant? Yes.
Well, we'll get that a bit next week, because Marx tries to pull it back in a bit. In here, he does kind of say, look, this machine technology and the machine techno system, if you want to call it that, is adequate to capital in certain spheres, but that there are certain spheres where actually circulating capital and the rules of circulating capital are such. And in the circulating capital, I would infer, he doesn't say so, but I would infer the circulating capital is still going to be working on the basis of the labor theory of value. So this is why I think it's important to distinguish between the kind of logic that you extract from the exploration of fixed capital and the logic that comes out of the reuniting of fixed capital and circulating capital. You can't have fixed capital without circulating capital. But the role of circulating capital in here is kind of pushed to one side in order to explore what might happen with fixed capital. When you reintroduce circulating capital into the question, you find the labor theory of value is likely to come back, because circulating capital is going to be organized. And I think the kind of model he would look to is say, well, okay, the workers in the cotton factories of Manchester conform to what he's talking about here. On the other hand, if you go out and look at the bakers and the others, they're working on the circulating capital, and you need this circulating capital to support the fixed capital. In other words, you would at a certain point say, what happens when you put circulating capital and fixed capital back together? What do they do? And in that instance, you would find there would be circulating capital would still be operating on the value theory. So the value theory would still have a position in those sectors. Now, what that means for how we understand fixed capital is, to me, a bit obscure. I don't quite figure it out. I can't figure that out. And Marx leaves it, I think, a bit obscure. But I think we're going to get back in very much into that kind of question next week, when he kind of says, well, it seems as if fixed capital value theory is irrelevant. On the other hand, it turns out the capital can't do without the value theory, so that they pull it back in some way. Now, how they pull it back is not explained, or at least I think it's not explained. But we're going to have another look at it next week to see what that might mean. But I think this is a very relevant kind of question.
Let me raise one. All right, another question. If capital is creating a new system by disempowering labor through the use of technology and knowledge while maintaining its dominance, could this new system be the seeds ending capitalism?
I don't think there's anything automatic of an answer to that. I can't say that it will or it won't. What I think it does is to set the stage for thinking about what the end of capitalism would look like when the kinds of technologies which have been developed have been actually developed in the ways that he's describing here. I think what Marx is maybe pushing towards is saying, well, look, why is it that the factory workers are not anywhere near as class conscious as they should be? And the answer has a lot to do with all the disempowerment and all of the rest of it, and that clearly the workers are alienated. They don't have the power to stop the system in the way they once had. So I think that Marx is trying to sort of say, well, if that's the situation, then what would the struggle for socialism do in relation to these technologies? He makes very clear at a certain point that the machines are not capital. And he's very clear about that because a lot of people kind of would say, well, the machines are capital and we need the machines, therefore we still need capitalism. And he's saying, no, that's not the case. The machines are simply machines. And they can be used one way or the other. And this idea that it's uses which are significant, the big question for socialists is how can these machines be used for socialist ends as opposed to capitalist ends? That would be the central question, I think. And of course, that then followed on the experience of factory production in Soviet Union, the ex-Soviet Union, and and Michael Burawoy's books on, for instance, Hungarian collective factory under communism, raising the question of how different is this really from what's going on in capital anyway. So then there's a question which we've already broached, which is to what degree can socialism rely upon the technologies which it has inherited to create a socialist society, or are those technologies so toxic that they have to be abandoned and thrown away and replaced by something radically different? In other words, that question, which has been raised in the Grundrisse, if you remember, we went over the double consciousness argument, applies very much to what we're encountering here. And I don't have a clear answer to that, but except to say that there are hints and arguments going on, which is why these passages in here are so interesting to study and to think about and reflect upon, because they raise all of these questions. Sorry, you had a comment, question?
I'm just wondering, this sort of question of the relationship between fixed capital, circulating capital, and the way in which increasing investments in fixed capital kind of devalues commodities, gradually leads to reduction in rate of profit potentially. Is it part of the explanation for deindustrialization and offshoring and seeking cheap sources of labor overseas? Is this, I mean, I've always had this question, so I'm asking it now, sort of if it's incredibly expensive. So it seems like the idea is that overcoming this problem of the labor theory of value, right? Seeking cheap reservoirs of labor rather than investing in huge amounts of machinery. That's my understanding about why something like clothing, has not been as automated as you might think it would be, partially because it's just always sort of cheaper to employ these sort of people in Bangladesh or wherever it might be, rather than the huge investments in fixed capital that would require. So is there also a sort of, moving back and forth between this kind of fixed capital and circulating capital?
Well, let's first separate out on the question of deindustrialization. The evidence is fairly strong that the main reason for deindustrialization was technological change rather than offshoring. Which doesn't say offshoring is irrelevant, but it says there's a tendency to think that the deindustrialization occurred purely because of competition from China or something like that, and that was the story that was strongly favored by the capitalist class, because then they could say, well, it's just globalization, we can't do anything about it. But in fact, it was the technological change, which is something you could do something about, was largely the issue. So the questions raised here around the technological change are relevant, I think, to that part of the argument. Now, when you look at offshoring, yes, you're looking at the movement of capital towards cheaper labor. But there are only certain areas where that works. Typically textiles, and you mentioned clothing and so on, that works very well. It doesn't work with some of the areas like making Apple computers or something of that kind, although Apple computers is very interesting because the labor force that was required for Apple computers did not exist in the United States. Apple tried 2 or 3 times to set up in the United States and failed. And it was Tim Cook who came in and said, well, the answer to that is there's a labor force that does meet our requirements, and it's in China, and we can get Foxconn to do it. And so that offshoring would be consistent with your argument, because the kind of line engineers and so on that you need for the Apple computer production and the iPhone production and all the rest of it, that labor force just didn't exist in the United States. Tim Cook said something like, if you set up a meeting asking for skilled line engineers in the United States, you could maybe fill a few classrooms. In China, you could fill 3 baseball fields. So the labor side of it was important in that case. And of course, we have seen in the Maquila programs in Mexico and so on, some of these things being offshored or Bangalore and call centers and so on. So that stuff is an important aspect. That's not being dealt with here, obviously. But the whole kind of question of control over labor, how do you control it? And it is really remarkable to me in many ways that by the mid-1980s, capital had almost total control over labor. And instead of backing off and kind of saying, okay, let's ease off, and it pushed even harder. And again, this comes out from I presume that resulted from competition. But some of the worst offenders were the monopoly powers, who pushed even harder. So why are they pushing harder when the profits are coming in pretty good and that? And it may have to do with what seems to me to be one of the signal efforts going on right now, which is a fear of what China might do. Because China had the labor force for the low-tech, labor-intensive. So value is being produced like crazy in China. But now China's moving to the high-tech. And if China moves to high-tech, God help us. I think they basically... This is why there's all this paranoia about China right now in U.S. industrial bourgeois circles and so on. Tremendous, and an attempt to prevent China from becoming high tech. I mean, it's a systematic attempt to do that, which is ridiculous, because the United States helped and tolerated and encouraged high-tech development in Japan, high-tech development in South Korea, high-tech development in Taiwan, for the simple reason that it wanted to have a high level of consumer society in all of those countries to contain China. So I wanted all that. I mean, this was U.S. policy. U.S. policy was not out to. It had particular arguments with Japan in the 1990s and so on. But generally speaking, the U.S. was very benevolent to economic development, which allowed those countries to go above the middle income trap and start to become high income. Because this was a way of telling that Chinese communism was awful, and it was. But then what happened was, when China liberated, what happened to production in China? Who took the high-tech stuff into China? Well, when I was there, there was this big industrial estate, and this was the Japanese quarter, this was the Taiwanese quarter, and this was the South Korean quarter. So all of the high-tech that had been allowed to flow into those countries flowed immediately into China. All right? So the Chinese had access to it immediately, because the Chinese took the role of saying, well, foreign investment is welcome provided you do it as a joint venture. You could only invest as a joint venture unless there were special circumstances, which meant the Chinese companies had access to all the high-tech knowledge they needed to develop their own structures. And now the United States is trying to dismantle that. I mean, it's not just simply prevent it; it's dismantle it. And so now we're seeing this battle over high tech and intellectual property rights. The United States played a big role in setting up the World Trade Organization, but hates the World Trade Organization because the United States keeps being found in violation of WTO rules. The only reason the United States hasn't entirely scuppered the World Trade Organization is because of the intellectual property rights agreements. The intellectual property rights are the main tool that the US is trying to use to prevent further development in China, but you can't do it. The Chinese are expert at stealing things. Actually, this has gone on for a long time. The United States stole a lot of stuff from Europe. So stealing this is not It's not unusual in this sphere. In fact, the accounts that are coming out from China of what the high-tech sector is like is they steal from each other. If somebody comes up with something which looks good, they better get it into production immediately, because if they don't, the idea will be stolen and somebody else will do it. I mean, the one account we have of it is, it says, you think if Silicon Valley is highly competitive, you're out of your mind, because when you go to China, it's doubly competitive. So in this instance, what you have is a combination of offshoring and the tech. And the offshoring is not simply taking existing activity. It's about offshoring of the low tech and the high tech. So that's a very much more complicated kind of story. But I think that fixed capital formation in China is a classic case of the way in which a society develops, and the way in which it became essential in China. If you were going to have this, for instance, this high-speed rail network they set up, 20,000 miles in 5 years or something like that, they already had the technology to do it. It was already on the back burner. And it was a vast employer of labor and all the rest of it. So it was but this is why China has the most sophisticated high-speed rail network anywhere. And of course, it turned out that they were trying to set one up between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and they were going to use Chinese technology, and Congress went crazy. So we have no high-speed rail network between San Francisco and Los Angeles, which when you think about it is nuts. But the Chinese don't have problems with that. They just go through private property rights, all that kind of thing. The state owns all the land, so there's no way in which anybody can stop it. So it's but I think the fixed capital formation in China, the last data I saw said about more than a third of Chinese development is now in fixed capital formation. Rostow used to say fixed capital formation should rise to 15% or something like that, but the Chinese are double that. And about 30% of that 30% is in housing alone. Now there's been a crisis in the housing sector, but that seems to be being financed. And the crisis in the housing sector had a lot to do with the lack of adequate financial institutions to monitor and regulate the flow of funds, so they didn't have a good credit system. So the story Marx tells here, that fixed capital requires a credit system, requires financial institutions, leads you to a class formation, a formation of a moneyed class. The story that he tells here in the Grundrisse is exactly replicated in China. And so it's so fascinating to sort of follow what's been going on in China and look at what's going on here. Which is why I think this is such a relevant text, and why this stuff on fixed capital formation is so important. Now, whether Marx got it all right and the bits that get left to one side is another question, but that's... Any other?
I had a follow-up, but does someone else have a question?
Yeah.
With deindustrialization, you sort of had a move towards this sort of service sector in the USA, as well as an increase in white-collar jobs, finance sector, etc. But now we have a new kind of fixed capital. I think it's fixed capital, which is sort of AI, ChatGPT, though it's a kind of not so fixed. I guess it does have physical infrastructure. And that seems to be threatening a new kind of potential deindustrialization
Yeah.
well, potentially, but also increased unemployment, potentially redundancy, and there's a question about what will be the next fix in this country. So, could you talk maybe a little bit about this idea of AI as a kind of fixed? Is it fixed capital?
Well, the answer to that is it depends on its use.
Sure.
That's the answer.
As a form of fixed capital, then does it come without some of the kinds of issues that have come with fixed capital in the past, namely the issue of how expensive fixed capital has been in the past, difficulties with technological improvements, the kinds of issues we've talked about today about machines. Yeah.
But again, the answer has to be, and this is the question, what is AI going to be used for? And how is it going to be used? Now, it can be used, and I'm sure will be used, to try to do the equivalent of deindustrialization in the service sector. And there are certain sectors, the service sector, that might easily disappear. I might lose my job, but I'm not cared. And you do, yes. Or, teaching may end up being, automated in these ways. So again, but that's going to depend on, social relations in the teaching sector and to the degree to which the penetration of the teaching sector by AI, and so that all adjunct teaching will be abolished in favor of automated, something of that kind. There will be obviously some resistance to that, and it'll depend very much on its use, but it might be used for other things, such as and we already see that in terms of people experimenting with it, making paintings and all kinds of things like that. There's another, which is a consumerist sort of thing. Then it's rather different. I am told that you can get summaries of my own books if you want on AI. You just go in there, and as a colleague said to me, "Thank God for that." So it is that's going to be the battle. And it's exactly the same way that when John Stuart Mill kind of said, look, there's machines are supposed to lighten the load of labor, but they seem to have made it worse. And Marx says, well, of course they made it worse because they were designed to make it worse because they were about labor control. And if AI is going to be introduced as a labor control thing, as a labor substitution tactic, then of course we're going to see all of the effects of, as we did, of deindustrialization. But there will be some areas which will likely spark upwards. For example, one of the things that Marx talks about here is a reduction of circulation time in the market down to zero, which means finding forms of consumerism which are instantaneous. And I think I talked about this before, that a large segment of capital is now selling experience, because experience is over once it's over. And so it's cruise liners and tourist stuff, which, by the way, requires heavy investment in fixed capital. Tourists, think of the fixed capital involved in the expansion of the tourist industry, and what that means, and just think about that, and then you see one of the connections, and AI may come into that, quite strongly. Exactly how, I don't know, but again, uses will be found, people say things like, well, the employment of paralegal to search texts and so on, That's all going to be artificial intelligence, and I don't know how many people have already used chat, whatever it is. I haven't used it, but I know quite a few people who have, and say it's very good. I hear very good, and therefore can save a lot of time for some people, which should then lead to free time. But will it? Marx's argument is no, because free time is always that which is taken by capital and turned into surplus value. That's what, as far as that's capital's definition of free time. The socialist definition is to liberate that time from surplus value production, so it's free time for people to do what they want. But that's, where we are.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, that last statement fits the context that you're just coming from France and they are increasing the retirement age and so. Okay, I have a question that might be, or its answer might be short or long. So we talked about how the use of the machines and AI and you talked about a socialist utilization or use of machinery and AI versus as opposed to the capitalist. But there is something that you mentioned, and I'm wondering whether it's a change of language, choice of language, or conceptually different. That there is a question whether, if we're thinking about moving towards a social society, the question of whether we want this machinery or we want to overthrow this machinery and replace it. So I'm so curious about this.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I would be curious about it too. I mean, but that always comes back. Is capital providing us with the kinds of technologies and forms of organization which are usable for other purposes, or is it offering us poisoned chalices that we if we adopt these technologies, in fact, they're so imbued in capitalist social relations that they are toxic in relationship to the achievement of a socialist society. And I don't know what the answer is, but it seems to me the question is important to ask, particularly since at this particular moment, I don't see that we're going to find socialism coming up very clearly, except in a very kind of modest way. But even at a modest level, there are questions. I think that in some areas like medical diagnoses and things like that, the evidence seems to suggest that AI is more efficient and better, and that these things properly monitored could be very, very helpfully deployed. So I would argue for trying to, in the here and now, find out ways in which artificial intelligence can be deployed in ways which are, quote, beneficial from a social standpoint, as opposed to I don't know, making the rockets and the military expenditures go in that kind of way. So again, has a lot to do with the nature of the uses. Okay. I think we're going to finish about here, but you have an announcement you wanted to make.
All right. Hey, y'all. Really quick for my in-person folks, just want to let you know that the TPF, the building, is going to be closed for the next 2 weeks, but we're going to open specifically for the class. So we won't be open before 3:30. So just make sure you don't get here before 3:30. All right. Sound good? So the cafe won't be open, but it'll be open for the class. And then right after, we'll close back up. Sound good? So it's for yeah, of course, anything for y'all. All right, it's going to be April 25th and May 2nd, and then May 9th through Zoom.
And you're all going to Cuba.
Yeah. That's
sunshine, tropicality.
Yeah, all right, thanks, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, read the next section carefully. These two chapters are really interesting.